The room is finally quiet, and that is when the mind starts trying hardest. The body is tired enough to want sleep. Nothing urgent is being asked of you. And still there is a new kind of effort in the air. You tell yourself to soften. You tell yourself not to push. Even that becomes one more thing to do correctly. Rest starts sounding like work. At first it seems obvious what the problem must be. Too many thoughts, too much memory, too much alertness at the wrong hour. Zen presses on a harder possibility. Maybe the trouble is not only the noise in the mind. Maybe peace has quietly become an object, something to acquire, something to preserve, something to measure yourself against. Once that happens, the search for quiet starts carrying the same strain as every other attempt to own what cannot be held by force. That is why Zen matters here. Not because it offers spiritual wallpaper for a hard night. It matters because it distrusts the one who wants to own stillness. It asks what kind of self is doing the seeking, what kind of effort hides inside that search, and what happens when the wish for peace hardens into another form of grasping. So I want to stay close to that contradiction tonight. By the end of tonight, I want to leave you with a clearer sense of why the pursuit of peace can make peace thinner, why Zen keeps mistrusting the mind that wants to capture stillness, and what kind of attention may remain when that grasp begins to loosen. If you enjoy thinking through questions like this with me, subscribing to the channel helps others find them too. Sharing the video helps even more. Let's begin. Peace begins as an ordinary wish. A long day ends. The body wants relief from its own heaviness. The mind wants a little less inward noise. Nothing about that wish is foolish. Nothing about it deserves ridicule. The night exposes how vulnerable human beings are to their own unquiet. A person does not have to be spiritually dramatic to know the feeling of wanting the mind to stop arguing with itself for a while. That wish is as plain as thirst. The change comes when the wish stops being a wish and turns into a project. You can feel the turn in very small movements. First there is fatigue, then there is inspection. Are the thoughts slowing down yet? Is the breathing better? Was that brief stretch of quiet real, or did it not count because it ended too fast? A calm moment becomes a score. A restless moment becomes evidence. Rest begins to look like performance. The body is lying down. Somewhere inwardly, an overseer has stood up. That overseer changes the whole mood of the room. Silence is no longer simply silence. It becomes material for evaluation. If the mind stays quiet, the person feels briefly successful. If the mind stirs again, they feel that something has gone wrong. The evening is no longer being lived, it is being administered. Even a good moment starts carrying fear, because the good moment now has to last, and whatever has to last can also fail. This is where peace becomes something to keep. At first that seems harmless. Of course a person would want a good state to continue, but the desire to keep calm immediately makes calm fragile. The self begins guarding it. One thought is allowed, another is not. One memory seems harmless, another feels dangerous. A person who wanted rest now spends the evening monitoring whether rest is still present. The quiet becomes inventory. The inventory becomes labor. The pattern is familiar because modern life teaches it everywhere else. Learn the right method. Apply the right discipline. Get the desired outcome. If progress slows, refine the method. If results weaken, adjust the system. Much of life does work this way. You can become stronger, more skilled, more informed, more efficient through exactly that logic. But peace becomes strangely unstable when it is approached as a collectible state. The more it is measured, the less fully it can be inhabited. The more tightly it is guarded, the less it feels like rest. It helps to see how ordinary this is. Someone finally feels a little quieter and immediately starts asking how to preserve it. Someone else notices that tonight is better than last night and starts constructing a plan for repeating it. Another person decides that a certain posture, phrase, or breathing pattern must be the reason the evening improved. Each reaction is understandable. Each reaction also changes the calm from an event into property. The mind is no longer meeting quiet, it is trying to own quiet. There is a physical cost to that turn. The shoulders tense around a goal that cannot be seen directly. The jaw tightens around a demand nobody else can measure. Breathing itself becomes suspicious. Was that exhale deep enough? Did that brief softness count? A person who wanted one honest moment of ease now keeps interrupting the moment to inspect it. The body is ready for sleep. The mind has appointed itself night manager. That manager is rarely gentle. The late hour makes the problem easier to catch because nothing dramatic is required. No crisis is needed. No catastrophe has to happen. A person can be safe, indoors, mostly finished with the day, and still feel caught in a small inward emergency. That emergency is not only made of thought, it is made of the stance that says peace must arrive, must last, and must confirm that I am finally handling myself correctly. Once that stance takes over, even a quiet room starts feeling like an exam. This title has to be heard carefully. Seeking peace makes it disappear does not mean peace is unreal. It does not mean the wish for quiet is corrupt. It means that a certain kind of seeking changes the shape of what it seeks. Peace becomes a prize. The prize must be obtained, protected, and kept from loss. Once that happens, the search itself introduces tension. The self cannot rest because it has turned rest into something it must secure. That is the first place Zen begins to sound more dangerous than comforting. It does not rush to reassure the seeker that better tactics will solve the problem. It asks whether the seeker has already smuggled the wrong relation into the room. The question is not only why the mind is noisy, the question is what sort of mind has decided that quiet must become property. Late at night, this pattern becomes painfully obvious. A person tells themselves not to force anything. That instruction itself becomes force. They try to let go. Letting go becomes another task. They try not to care so much whether the mind is calm, and now they are anxiously checking whether they have stopped caring correctly. The search has become self-surveillance. Even the attempt to stop trying is still a sophisticated version of trying. Zen enters at exactly that point, not to say that quiet does not matter, not to say that the body should enjoy unrest. Zen enters because it understands something exact about the way desire becomes ownership. It sees that the night is not made difficult only by thought. It is made difficult by the self that turns peace into a possession and then stands guard over it. That is where the argument begins. It also helps to notice how quickly memory joins the project. A person remembers a better night and begins trying to reconstruct it exactly. What position was I in? What did I eat? What thought finally let go? Which sentence helped? The memory of calm becomes a recipe. The recipe becomes another measuring device. The mind is no longer resting in the present room. It is trying to reproduce a private success from the past. Even nostalgia becomes one more arm of acquisition. That is why the first correction cannot be a technique. The first correction has to be recognition. Before any deeper doctrine appears, the person has to see the manager at work. They have to hear the inward clerk checking results. Zen begins by making that clerk less invisible. Once the acquisitive structure is visible, the wish for peace can stop pretending to be innocent in every form it takes. Then the tradition can show why it distrusts the seeker without mocking the human need that gave rise to the search. Even that recognition can change the room a little. The person may still be restless, but they are no longer entirely identified with the restlessness plus the management of the restlessness. They can hear the inward checking as checking. They can notice the demand for proof as demand. That slight separation is not yet freedom. It is simply the first crack in the project by which peace had been turned into one more possession to earn. Many people approach spiritual life the same way they approach everything else. They arrive with need, with sincerity, with effort, and with the old habit of turning every meaningful activity into a way of getting something they can later claim. That habit can look serious. It can even look admirable. If you really care, surely you should want the outcome strongly. Surely you should discipline yourself. surely you should measure whether you are getting closer. Zen does not deny the dignity of effort. What it keeps challenging is the hidden acquisitive structure inside effort. One plain way to name that structure is gaining mind. The gaining mind treats practice as acquisition. Get peace, get awakening, get clarity, get rid of the bad state, keep the better one. Carry the reward forward as proof that something important has happened. There is nothing exotic about this. The same arrangement appears in work, ambition, reputation, romance, and self-improvement. Zen sounds unusual because it notices how easily the same arrangement can survive inside prayer, silence, sitting, chanting, reading, and contemplation. This is why Zen often sounds suspicious of the seeker, not suspicious of suffering, not suspicious of the wish to be free of needless strain, suspicious of the self that approaches freedom as possession, suspicious of the one who says, "I will do the proper inward work so that stillness becomes mine." The self remains owner, manager, and beneficiary. Practice becomes machinery for profit. The room may look different. The inward arrangement has not changed. That is hard to hear because the arrangement is so normal. We are trained to admire the person who brings discipline and ambition to whatever matters, and there are fields where that response is wise. But Zen sees how indiscriminate those habits can become. A person brings their managerial intelligence into the evening. They begin optimizing tranquility. They begin trying to become efficient at stillness. They begin studying themselves the way they might study a business problem. Nothing in that sounds silly from the outside. Yet the whole inward posture is still organized around ownership and result. Classical Chan material gives this a sharper edge. In the exchange about ordinary mind and the way later collected in the gateless gate, pursuit itself becomes the issue. The more the way is treated as something to capture, the more it recedes. That is not a mystical trick. It is a judgment about objectification. If the way is imagined as prey, the hunter has already separated themselves from what they seek. The pursuit is not innocent. It already contains the wrong shape of relation. What makes this difficult is that pursuit usually feels noble. We are used to thinking that the one who wants the truth most intensely is closest to it. Zen keeps finding a complication. Intensity can hide possession. Seriousness can hide greed. Spiritual language can hide the same bargaining logic that rules ordinary ambition. A person may become proud of the very effort that keeps them trapped. They may treat their discipline as evidence of moral superiority, while never noticing that the whole discipline is still arranged as a hunt for a private reward. This is also why correct words are not enough. Someone may be able to speak fluently about non-attachment, no mind, openness, and acceptance, yet still remain governed by gaining mind. They may know the criticism of grasping by heart, and still turn that criticism into one more possession. Zen does not let vocabulary excuse the structure beneath it. It is suspicious of the seeker precisely because the seeker can survive inside refined ideas and dignified effort, yet Zen's suspicion is not a form of contempt. The seeker is not a villain. The seeker is the ordinary self, using the habits it knows best. It fears instability. It wants relief. It has learned to respond to what matters by tightening control. Zen exposes that habit not to humiliate the person, but to show why spiritual seriousness alone does not solve the problem. If peace is still being pursued as property, the search has already taken on the shape of unrest. There is even a kind of mercy in that. If the problem were only a lack of effort, then the burden would fall entirely on the person to work harder, purer, more successfully. Zen says the burden may be misdescribed from the start. The self that wants to own stillness could itself be one of the causes of disturbance. That changes the question. No longer how can the same seeker become more effective. Now the question is what kind of self is doing the seeking at all. It helps to name how easily the gaining mind hides inside admirable behavior. A person sits very straight. They return to the breath with discipline. They read the right page slowly. They choose a quiet hour. None of that is false, yet inwardly they may still be bargaining. If I do this honestly enough, then the right state should finally be mine. If I am serious enough, then surely stillness must reward me. The self remains accountant, investor, and future owner. Spiritual language has been laid over commercial instincts. This is why a line from the old Chan material can sound almost rude at first. In the exchange about ordinary mind and the way, the trouble is not lack of sincerity, the trouble is the very form of pursuit. When the way is chased like an object, distance is created by the chase itself. The hunter imagines a prize over there and a self over here that will one day capture it. The relation is already split before the effort begins. Zen hears that split and mistrusts it. The mistake is easy to miss because pursuit often feels pure. We admire those who really want the truth. We praise those who bring intensity to what matters. But wanting can become possessive without announcing itself. Seriousness can become a polished form of greed. Even a person who speaks humbly can still be trying to make peace serve as a credential. Zen keeps pressing against that subtle greed. It is not impressed just because the object being hunted happens to be calm instead of money or status. So the seeker is mistrusted for a narrow and important reason. Not because longing is shameful, not because practice should become passive. The mistrust falls on the self that always wants to stand apart from experience long enough to turn it into gain. Once that pattern is recognized, Dogen can push the matter deeper. The problem is not only that the seeker wants the wrong thing, the problem is how the self itself keeps stepping forward as owner, manager, and measure. There is an old habit of self-congratulation that belongs here too. A person can become proud of wanting peace for noble reasons. They are not pursuing money now. They are not pursuing applause. They are pursuing something pure, yet the structure may remain almost untouched. The desired object has changed names, but the self still wants to secure it, display it inwardly, and feel confirmed by having it. Zen keeps pointing at that continuity. It wants the person to see that spiritual ambition can still be ambition. This is why Zen often feels less flattering than other forms of reassurance. Reassurance tells the seeker they are basically on the right track and only need a more effective method. Zen asks whether the track itself has been laid by possession. That question does not cancel discipline, it cleans the motive inside discipline. Before anything can be called freedom, the self has to lose some of its appetite for making stillness serve as personal capital. Dogen's writing matters here because he does not leave the problem at the level of mood. In Koan, he describes carrying the self forward to experience things and contrasts that with a relation in which things come forth and illuminate the self. The sentence is compact, but it changes the whole discussion. Unrest is no longer only a matter of too much mental activity. It is also a matter of how the self approaches experience. The evening is not just happening, it is being arranged by a center that wants to possess and manage what appears. That stance feels normal because almost all of modern life trains it. We act, assess, improve, and protect from the standpoint of a self that takes itself as the governing reference point. So when the mind will not settle, the obvious response is to let the self step forward more firmly. It will supervise the breathing. It will judge the thoughts. It will select the right interpretation. It will apply pressure where needed. But Dogen's line raises a suspicion. What if the self-forward movement is not a neutral cure descending into chaos? What if it is one of the forms the chaos has taken? This can be felt very concretely. You lie still, and instead of simply being in the room, you begin leaning toward yourself. Are you doing the night correctly? Is that thought acceptable? Is the body soft enough now? Are you drifting closer to rest or failing to? The self becomes observer, foreman, critic, and beneficiary all at once. Every appearance is immediately taken back into the sphere of me and my progress. The hand reaches first. Then it complains that the water moved. Dogen's well-known movement from studying the Buddha way to studying the self and then forgetting the self matters because it refuses the usual conclusion. We tend to think more self-knowledge should mean stronger self-management. If I understand my habits precisely enough, I will finally organize myself into peace. Dogen's sequence breaks that confidence. Study does not culminate in perfected ownership. It culminates in loosening ownership. Self-forgetting is not self-hatred. It is the weakening of the self as central claimant and measure. That distinction is essential. If self-forgetting were heard as a demand to become nobody, Zen would turn into a strange denial of human life. But the self being loosened is the appropriating center. The self that says my calm, my failure, my proof, my state. The self that turns the entire evening into a referendum on its competence. To forget that self is not to vanish from reality. It is to stop forcing reality to pass through ownership at every step. Once that is seen, late-night restlessness changes its shape. The trouble is no longer only that thoughts exist. The trouble is that each thought is being taken up by a self whose whole posture is appropriation. The one chasing peace is not outside the problem. The inward manager belongs to the noise. The supervisor who was supposed to save the evening may be one of the ways the evening keeps becoming unlivable. Dogen's reversal also makes receptivity newly important. When things come forth and illuminate the self, the world is no longer reduced to material for control. A sound can be sound before it becomes evidence. A bodily sensation can be felt before it is judged. A memory can arise before it is recruited into a total story of success or failure. This is not dreamy passivity. It is an undoing of appropriation. The mind need not stand over every appearance in order for the appearance to matter. There is a hidden tenderness in this. The self that treats peace as property also treats failure as personal indictment. The evening becomes a courtroom. If calm is absent, then I have done something wrong. If thought returns, then I am not progressing. Dogen weakens that courtroom by weakening the owner. The person no longer has to win a state in order to count as adequate. That does not end suffering. It changes the mode in which suffering is interpreted and owned. This is why Dogen makes the next step unavoidable. If the self-forward stance is already part of the disturbance, then practice cannot mean rewarding the same stance later with a better possession. Something about effort itself has to change. The ordinary bargain between means and ends can no longer be trusted without question. One way to feel Dogen's point is to notice how quickly experience is turned into a report about the self. A breath is not just a breath. It becomes evidence that I am calming down, or evidence that I am failing. A memory is not just a memory. It becomes proof that I have not advanced far enough beyond the day. Even silence is not just silence. It becomes a stage on which the self anxiously waits to find out whether it is finally doing inner life well. This is what carrying the self forward looks like in plain terms. Everything is made to answer to ownership. When Dogen says that studying the self ends in forgetting the self, he is not telling a person to erase biography, duty, or affection. He is loosening the claim of central ownership. The self no longer has to stand at the center of every event announcing mine, my progress, my setback, my calm, my failure. Self-study without self-forgetting can become one more project of inward management. It can make the owner more informed while leaving ownership untouched. Dogen cuts deeper than that. The phrase about being enlightened by all things can sound remote until it is brought back to the room. It means the world need not always arrive as raw material for the manager. A creak in the house does not have to become a sign that the night is ruined. A sensation in the chest does not have to become a story about personal inadequacy before it can be felt. The room can disclose itself before it is enlisted into the self's campaign. That is a different relation, and it is gentler without being vague. What falls away first is not pain. It is the claim to administer pain from a place outside it. The inward overseer begins to look less like a rescuer and more like one of the ways the strain keeps reproducing itself. That matters because the next step is no longer to perfect the overseer. It is to question the bargain by which every disciplined act was supposed to purchase a future reward for that same self. The more concrete this becomes, the more unsettling Dogen sounds. The self does not merely appear after the fact and interpret the night. It steps into the night early and arranges the whole field. It decides what counts as progress. It decides what counts as failure. It decides which sensations are acceptable and which are threatening. Then it complains that the room feels tight. Dogen's point is not abstract. The organizer of the room may be one of the reasons the room has become so hard to inhabit. That insight can be quieting even before it is comforting. A person does not have to believe every inward verdict once they see how many verdicts are being produced by the same owner. The courtroom loses authority. There may still be suffering, but there is less need to treat suffering as a perfect judgment on the self. When that authority weakens, effort itself can start to change. It no longer has to serve the same old judge wearing more philosophical clothing. Most of life is governed by a simple pattern. Do this in order to get that. Learn a discipline, secure an outcome, apply effort, receive improvement. There is wisdom in that pattern. Without it, much of practical life would collapse. Yet when it is carried untouched into spiritual practice, Zen becomes difficult in a very particular way. A person sits down, reads carefully, breathes slowly, or enters silence, and almost immediately the old bargain begins to operate. I will do this now so that peace arrives later. I will endure this method so that the right state becomes mine. Dogen's idea that practice and realization are not two separate things interrupts that bargain. The phrase can sound technical, but the point is plain enough to feel. Practice is not merely preparation for a later prize. It is not justified only by a future possession. If it is treated only that way, the gaining mind has already claimed the entire field. The body may be still. Inwardly, a contract has been signed. I give effort. I receive calm. I invest discipline. I earn the better self. That contract quietly changes the act itself. Someone may sit with a stopwatch in the mind. They may be physically present, but mentally leaning toward profit. Is it working yet? Is this session better than yesterday? Did that moment of quiet mean the method is finally paying out? Once practice is arranged as transaction, self-surveillance becomes inseparable from it. The act is no longer enough to be itself. It must also serve as evidence of future gain. Zen objects to this not because it despises effect, but because the whole possessive relation is already inside the effort. The self is still standing outside what it does, waiting to be rewarded. Peace is still being imagined as property. Practice is still being used as machinery for purchase. Under those conditions, even serious discipline can become another way of tightening the knot. The person is trying to buy stillness from the evening. This is why non-gaining does not mean inactivity. That is one of the easiest and least serious misunderstandings. Once the bargain is criticized, people often imagine the only alternative is not to care, not to work, not to return, not to hold posture, not to continue. Zen does not support that laziness disguised as insight. The body still sits, attention still returns, discipline remains real. What changes is the hidden logic inside the discipline. The hand can still move. It no longer has to move as a fist. Think of how this plays out at night. A person tries to relax because they want relaxation to pay out as sleep. Another follows a calming routine because the routine is expected to deliver a result. A third repeats a phrase inwardly because the phrase seems like a tool for getting rid of the wrong mental state. None of these actions are absurd, yet once they become bargaining instruments, they carry their own tension. The evening becomes market logic under gentler lighting. Dogen's challenge is to imagine action without transaction, practice as attendance rather than purchase, return rather than profit, a real doing that does not constantly lean beyond itself in order to justify itself. This is hard because the modern self knows how to improve but not how to act, without making ownership the secret beneficiary. The mind wants every gesture to lead somewhere it can later claim. If practice is approached differently, something subtle shifts. A person is no longer checking each breath as if each breath were a share rising or falling in value. The act is not stripped of seriousness, it is stripped of bookkeeping. That does not guarantee peace. Zen does not promise that a less acquisitive practice instantly becomes easy or pleasant. It means only that the old distortion has been named clearly enough that the act can stop serving the fantasy of reward quite so completely. The next misunderstanding then appears. If practice is not a purchase, perhaps the state being sought must be a blank one beyond thought altogether. Zen refuses that too. No mind is not the prize at the end of a successful transaction. It is not mental anesthesia. This is where Dogen and later Soto explanations sound almost scandalous to a modern ear. We are used to honoring practices because of what they produce. A workout earns strength. Study earns competence. Savings earns security. So the mind naturally approaches sitting the same way. If I do this correctly enough, then I should become the kind of person who possesses calm more reliably. Practice, realization interrupts that contract. It says the act is not merely a payment laid down for a future state. The act itself is already where the path is being enacted. That does not make practice dreamy or unserious. In some ways it makes it harder. Transaction is emotionally simple. We know how to invest for payoff. Attendance without guaranteed payoff is more demanding because it exposes how much of our discipline depends on fantasy of ownership. To return to posture, to breath, or to simple presence without turning return into a private investment asks for a cleaner sincerity. The act has to be honest even when no certificate arrives afterward. You can feel the difference at night. Under the old contract, each moment is checked for return on investment. Was that minute useful? Am I closer now? Did this finally pay out as sleep? Under a less acquisitive relation, return still happens, but it is not carrying the same secret bookkeeping. The person comes back because coming back is the act. They breathe because breathing is the act. They sit because sitting is the act. Profit stops being the hidden owner of every movement. This is why non-gaming cannot be reduced to doing nothing. A person still keeps the body here. They still resume the path of attention when it wanders. They still practice. Zen is not praising slackness. It is cutting the inward bargain that says all seriousness must cash out as private possession. Once that bargain weakens, the next confusion becomes visible. People often imagine the only reward worthy of such discipline must be a mind emptied of all thought. Zen blocks that fantasy too. There is something almost embarrassing about how often the bargain returns. A person may understand perfectly well that practice is not a purchase, and 10 minutes later they are still checking for profit. That return does not mean the argument failed. It means the transactional habit is deep. We are trained from childhood to ask what an act gets us. Zen does not remove that training with one insight. It keeps exposing it until the person can see the contract being signed in real time. That exposure can change the feeling of effort itself. Effort becomes less dramatic when it is not constantly asked to justify itself with future gain. A person can sit without turning sitting into investment. They can return without turning return into evidence of worth. The act becomes smaller and cleaner. In a strange way, this can feel more demanding than ambition, because ambition always holds out a prize. Zen asks for honesty without immediate possession. That makes its refusal of blankness easier to understand. A mind emptied as reward would only restore the old contract at a higher price. Practice without reward, therefore, does not become meaningless. It becomes intimate. The body keeps the appointment with the moment instead of making a contract with the future. That kind of intimacy is quiet and hard to brag about. Nothing spectacular can be shown for it. Yet it may be more faithful to Zen than 100 tales of dramatic states, because it leaves less room for the owner to hide behind spiritual profit. One of the strongest fantasies about peace is that peace must mean nothing is happening inside. No thoughts, no memories, no internal motion. A perfectly cleared room where the mind has finally stopped producing weather. Zen is often dragged into that fantasy because phrases like no mind and no thought seem to support it. A tired person hears those phrases and imagines the ideal as total inner silence. But serious Chan and Zen sources repeatedly block that conclusion. Huineng is especially important here because his teaching on no thought refuses the idea that thought itself is the enemy. No thought does not mean literal absence of mental events. It does not mean becoming blank, inert, stupid, or disconnected from life. It means that thought is no longer stained by clinging. Thought can still arise. What changes is the sticky relation by which each thought is turned into possession verdict, or self-definition. The mind is not emptied of movement, it is less trapped inside movement. This becomes easier to hear when brought close to experience. A sound from another room can be heard without becoming a crisis. A passing image can arise without being promoted into a ruler of the night. A memory can touch the mind without immediately commanding ownership. No thought is not a padded room inside the head. It is freedom from the reflex that turns each appearance into something to grab, fear, or defend against, as if the self's whole fate were hanging on it. Dogen's difficult phrase about thinking not thinking points in a similar direction. It is often treated like pure paradox, but its real work is to break a false choice. The mind is not being forced to choose between ordinary discursiveness and brute suppression. Zen does not simply oppose noise with blankness. It points toward a relation in which mental activity can continue without the old lunging and appropriation. The self does not have to throw itself at every thought in order to remain present. This matters because the fantasy of blankness makes the night more violent. If peace means empty consciousness, then every returning thought becomes scandal. The person is no longer merely tired, they are now failing at inner erasure. The evening turns punitive. Zen's refusal of mindlessness interrupts that punishment. It says that peace cannot be reduced to nothing happening. A mind may still move. The question is whether movement instantly becomes ownership. There is also something humane in this refusal. If peace required total absence of thought, then much of human life would stand under suspicion. Grief would count against serenity because it moves too much. Responsibility would count against serenity because it recalls unfinished tasks. Love itself might seem troublesome because it keeps drawing the mind outward. Zen's better sources do not demand such a narrowed humanity. No thought does not require becoming less alive. It requires becoming less adhesive. That does not trivialize pain. Some thoughts arrive with great force. Some nights are full of real fear. Zen does not ask anyone to pretend those realities are illusions. It says only that the self makes them heavier when it turns them into owned evidence and total verdict. The person who believes every thought proves failure has already intensified the burden. The burden is no longer just the thought, it is the self's claim upon the thought. So peace without vacancy becomes possible, not because thoughts disappear, but because thought is no longer being handled like contraband or treasure. The room may still contain sound, the mind may still contain memory. Calm is no longer identified with perfect sterilization. It begins to look more like a changed relation to what comes and goes. The self is less busy seizing, grading, and resisting the stream. Once that change is glimpsed, another famous Zen phrase can be heard with more seriousness. Ordinary mind is not a lazy slogan about being whatever you already are. It belongs to the same effort to free the mind from contrivance, without turning freedom into a performance. The fantasy of blankness is powerful because it promises certainty. If peace equals zero thoughts, then the whole night can be scored with brutal simplicity. Either the mind is empty enough or it is not. But this simple standard is also cruel. It turns consciousness itself into an enemy to be sterilized. A single memory becomes contamination. A single feeling becomes proof of failure. Huineng's correction matters because it blocks that cruelty at the root. No thought is not an emptied skull. It is thought no longer sticky with grasping. Dogen's phrase about thinking not thinking helps for the same reason. He is refusing both crude options, not ordinary discursiveness without end, not dead suppression. The third thing is harder to name because naming it too quickly turns it into a slogan. Still, it can be felt. Thought occurs, but the self does not leap to wrap identity, fear, and ownership around every occurrence. The mind can move without immediately converting movement into a project. This does not produce magical serenity. Some thoughts still pierce. Some memories still return with real heat. Zen is not claiming that good philosophy makes difficult content harmless. It is claiming that suffering grows when every appearance is instantly turned into owned evidence. Thought may still be painful. What begins to change is the reflex by which pain must also become proof that the entire night, and perhaps the entire self, has failed. That is why peace without vacancy is such an important phrase for this tradition. The room does not need to become acoustically perfect. The mind does not need to become pure blank surface. Quiet becomes thinkable again because it is no longer confused with anesthesia. The person does not need to kill consciousness in order to stop being tyrannized by it. That prepares the way for Mazu's language about ordinary mind, which sounds simple only until the ego tries to use it as a costume. There is a way this changes the feel of a hard night even before anything like serenity arrives. A person can hear a thought and not immediately treat it as contamination. They can notice that memory has returned without declaring the evening ruined. They can feel the pull to erase everything and understand that the pull itself is part of the old bargain. This does not make the room instantly calm. It does make the room less punitive. The person is no longer being asked to prove worth by producing inner vacancy on command. Another way to hear Huineng is to notice how quickly we turn thinking into a referendum on worth. A difficult thought appears, and immediately the self asks what kind of person would still be thinking this. That second movement often hurts more than the first. The thought becomes loaded with shame, with urgency, with the need to solve oneself through control. No thought weakens that loading. It does not ask the mind to become mute. It asks whether thought can lose some of the glue by which the self sticks to it. That is why blankness is too small a dream for Zen. Blankness would only be one more state to acquire and defend. It would still leave the owner in place, congratulating itself for having emptied the room successfully. Zen wants something more radical and less dramatic. It wants the owner to lose some of its rights over whatever appears. Then thought can continue without automatically becoming drama. Silence can continue without automatically becoming treasure. The room is no longer divided so sharply between contamination and reward. Zen has a way of making the ordinary sound difficult because the self is always tempted by the special. It wants exceptional states. It wants dramatic insight. It wants an inward atmosphere that can be admired, perhaps even by itself. So when Mazu says ordinary mind is the way, the phrase is almost impossible not to flatten. Some hear a soft invitation to be natural in whatever way currently pleases them. Others hear a little wisdom card about simple presence. Neither reading comes close to the discipline hidden in the phrase. Ordinary mind in this context does not mean ordinary distraction left untouched. It does not mean ordinary vanity, ordinary resentment, or ordinary impulse baptized as wisdom. It means something closer to uncontrived mind not busy fabricating a spiritual version of itself, mind not arranging a special atmosphere in order to feel elevated, mind that does not need to dress itself in solemnity before it can be close to what is present. The word ordinary cleanses by taking glamour away. This is why Zen aesthetics can become such a trap. A person lowers the voice, slows the gestures, decorates the room, adopts certain phrases, and begins to look like someone at peace. Yet all of it can remain deeply acquisitive. Calm becomes costume, silence becomes branding. The self is still advancing, only now it advances in robes that look harmless. Ordinary mind cuts against that because it leaves less room for self-dramatization. The path is not validated by atmosphere. That does not mean form is meaningless. Posture matters. Ritual matters. Discipline matters. Zen is not congratulating the ego for doing whatever feels spontaneous. The issue is contrivance. The issue is the self's need to manufacture a second self called spiritual self and then admire that construction. Mazu's phrase strips away the appetite for that manufacture. Nothing special is not the same as nothing matters. The return to everyday life is essential here. The cup, the floor, the threshold, the waiting, the fatigue in the shoulders, the sound from outside. These do not disappear because philosophy arrives. In serious Zen reflection, they are the actual field of the question. That is why ordinary mind cannot be reduced to a pleasant mood. The ordinary world is where grasping shows itself most clearly. It is where the self tries to convert common life into either a burden to escape or a stage for inner distinction. This also answers a hidden fear. Many people worry that if specialness is removed, life will become dull. Without elevated states, what is left? Ordinary mind answers by changing the standard. The point is not to feel impressed by your own calm. The point is to be less imprisoned by the need to feel impressed. Contact replaces spectacle. The cup can be handled without performance. The breath can be noticed without becoming a badge. The room can remain simple without feeling spiritually insufficient. Still, a boundary is needed. Ordinary mind does not mean whatever the ego happens to do is already the way. That reading simply flatters existing habit. Zen is not saying that distraction, impulse, and self-importance should be accepted because they are ordinary. It is saying that the path is not found through fabrication, posing, or spiritual costume. Discipline remains, reflection remains. What disappears is the theatre of self-elevation. Seen this way, ordinary mind belongs to the same critique of possession we have been following all along. The self wants peace as special property. Zen keeps returning it to uncontrived relation. The room need not become sacred scenery in order for wisdom to matter. The difficult part is not finding a special atmosphere. The difficult part is meeting the ordinary without needing to turn it into proof of identity. One reason this is difficult is that spiritual theatre can feel safer than ordinary life. A dim room, a refined vocabulary, a measured voice, a carefully chosen posture can all create the impression that something important is happening. Zen does not deny that form has value. What it denies is that atmosphere by itself proves a changed relation. A person can perform peace while remaining deeply acquisitive. Calm can become a costume the owner wears in order to admire itself more elegantly. Mazu's phrase about ordinary mind attacks exactly that temptation. It says the way is not hidden inside a specially decorated version of yourself. It is not something that appears only once the ego has learned to look refined. The danger of the special state is not only that it is rare, it is that the self immediately wants to own it, display it, and live from it as prestige. Ordinary mind strips that glamour away. It leaves less for vanity to feed on. At the same time, ordinary mind does not excuse laziness. It does not mean follow every impulse, because every impulse is natural. Zen has never said that ordinary confusion is already wisdom just because it is common. The discipline remains, the body still returns, attention still matters. What falls away is contrivance, and with it the appetite to manufacture a spiritually flattering self-image. The ordinary becomes demanding because it gives the ego less scenery in which to hide. Once that ordinary field is accepted as the real field, the question tightens around thought again. Thoughts still arise in ordinary life. Feelings still arise. The issue cannot be their mere presence. The issue is what turns them from passing events into a knot the self cannot stop tightening. That is also why ordinary mind should not be confused with low standards. It is not telling a person to stop caring about discipline or truth. It is telling them to stop using specialness as proof. The ordinary is harder than the exceptional in one respect. It gives the ego less applause. You do not get to feel elevated just because you are sitting in a serious pose or using serious language. You have to meet the same cup, the same floor, the same waiting, without turning them into props in a private drama. In that way, ordinary mind keeps the whole discussion honest. If peace only matters in extraordinary conditions, then peace remains a luxury item. If clarity only appears in carefully staged spiritual weather, then clarity is still serving vanity. Mazu's phrase pulls everything back down to the human scale, where ownership is easier to see. The way is not hidden in spectacle. It is hidden by the self that keeps needing spectacle. Once that is felt, the trouble inside thought can be described more accurately. This is also why ordinary mind can feel almost insulting to vanity. The ego wants distinction. It wants to be the sort of person who has crossed into a finer interior climate than everyone else. Ordinary mind answers by removing the stage. Here is the same hallway, the same chair, the same cup cooling by the bed, the same body that is neither heroic nor disgraceful. Can life be met there without the hunger to decorate it into proof? That is a more serious challenge than collecting exotic experiences. It is tempting to say that thoughts are the problem. The mind keeps moving, therefore peace is lost. Zen keeps making a finer distinction. A thought is not yet a trap. A thought is not automatically a wound. The first appearance may be brief, light, almost weightless. What makes it heavy is the relation the self enters into with it. The thought becomes mine in the sense of my failure, my fear, my burden, my unfinished story, my proof that peace has not been secured. That distinction matters because it changes how the evening is interpreted. A memory rises. If the memory is immediately taken as evidence of failure, the night tightens around it. A practical concern returns. If the concern is turned at once into a total indictment of the mind, the strain increases. The self is not only experiencing the thought, it is promoting the thought into an owner's report. The not is not bare appearance. The not is appropriation. This is why Huineng's language about no thought is so important. The problem is not that something appears. The problem is the stain of clinging. Zen is not asking the mind to become dead. It is asking whether appearance can remain appearance without instantly becoming property. A thought can still hurt. It can still matter, yet it need not be turned into a throne or a prison. The self can stop kneeling to what passes through it. That may sound delicate until one notices how often life is organized by the opposite movement. We take each thought personally. We ask what it proves. We ask what it says about our progress. We ask whether it means the evening is ruined. We bind our identity to the weather of the next few minutes. Zen does not mock this reflex. It exposes how quickly it turns the stream of mind into a warehouse of owned material. The thought itself may be brief. Ownership gives it residency. This is also where stain and fixation become useful words, provided they stay close to experience. The self does not merely notice a thought. It grips it, resists it, brands itself by it, or tries to destroy it. The thought becomes sticky because it is no longer allowed to pass as event. It has been converted into a personal asset or threat. That is how repetition acquires force. It is not only that the same content returns, it is that the self keeps meeting the content through ownership. Zen's answer cannot simply be stop thinking, because that would leave the structure of ownership intact. Nor can the answer be stop caring, because that would collapse non-grasping into indifference. The path is subtler. Open hands are not absent hands. A person can remain close to grief, fear, desire, or memory without immediately turning them into property to defend or evidence to fear. That is demanding because our culture teaches two crude modes, total identification or hard detachment. Zen tries to imagine a third. That third relation is why non-grasping is not emotional thinness. Love can remain love without becoming anxious ownership. Grief can remain grief without becoming the whole definition of the self. Concern can remain concern without hardening into obsessive control. The feeling is not denied. The contract around the feeling loosens. A person stops making every appearance swear loyalty to the private state of the owner. No one should pretend this is easy. Old patterns return quickly. A thought that is recognized as passing may still be seized a moment later. Fear may still close the hand. Shame may still demand total identification. Zen offers no guarantee against return. What it offers is a more exact account of where the knot is tied. That exactness matters because it stops the person from blaming bare consciousness for what appropriation has done. And once appropriation is seen inside thought, language itself becomes suspicious in a new way. Words can name the difference, yet words can also be seized, simplified, and used as possessions. That is where the next turn begins. So much unnecessary struggle begins with a false diagnosis. The person thinks the problem is that thought appeared at all, so they fight appearance itself. They try to seal the mind. They panic at each return. Zen asks for a subtler honesty. A thought may arise and vanish without much trouble. What makes it tyrannical is often the self that fastens to it, interprets it, and recruits it into a wider argument about personal failure or threatened ownership. Huineng's language about stain becomes useful here if it stays plain. A thought is stained when the self smears possessiveness across it. My anxiety, my proof, my inability to settle, my sign that tonight is ruined. The content may be painful on its own, but appropriation gives it a second life. It is made to serve identity. It is made to serve verdict. That is why repetition feels so heavy. The thought is not just repeating. Ownership keeps resigning the contract. Non-grasping, therefore, cannot mean emotional absence. A person is still allowed to care. Grief still grieves. Fear still feels like fear. Longing still longs. Zen is not trying to sand human life down into bland detachment. It is trying to loosen the reflex that converts every feeling into territory to defend or evidence to fear. Open hands are not dead hands. They are hands not closing around every passing event as if survival depended on possession. When this begins to make sense, the role of words becomes more delicate. We need words to distinguish thought from clinging. We need words to keep no thought from collapsing into blankness. Yet words themselves can also become owned things. The self can clutch a formula just as quickly as it clutches a mood. That is why Zen keeps moving from explanation toward a more suspicious view of conceptual control. There is a practical relief hidden inside this distinction. If bare thought is not the enemy, then the person no longer has to panic every time consciousness moves. They can ask a different question, not why did something appear, but how am I holding what appeared? Am I gripping it, fighting it, turning it into proof? That question is more demanding than simple suppression, but it is also more truthful. It keeps blame from falling on consciousness as such, and it sets up the next difficulty. Once the person learns to distinguish thought from clinging, they naturally want a clean sentence that captures the difference forever. They want a formula they can carry into the next hard night. Zen understands that desire too well. It knows how quickly a helpful phrase becomes another owned object. So the problem of words has to be faced directly. There is one more reason the distinction matters. When people think thought itself is the enemy, they often start fearing their own minds in a crude way. Consciousness becomes suspect. Zen does not encourage that fear. It treats fear of thought as another way the owner tightens control. A living mind will move. A human heart will continue to remember, anticipate, and imagine. The work is not to become less human. The work is to become less adhesive in the human way one already is. There is a special relief that comes from finding the right sentence. A pattern that felt vague suddenly becomes clear because language finally catches it. We know that experience well. Zen knows it too. It uses words constantly, it tells stories, it preserves dialogues, it comments on earlier masters, it names distinctions with great care. So when Zen presses against language, it is not making a childish claim that speech is beneath truth. It is doing something more exact. It is refusing to let language become ownership of what it names. This refusal matters because the self loves secure formulas. If one sentence could solve the whole matter, the ego would gladly hold that sentence like a receipt. Stop seeking, let go, be ordinary, no mind. Each phrase can point. Each phrase can also become a possession. The shortest line often carries the strongest temptation because it feels final. Once the self owns the formula, it imagines it owns the reality behind the formula. Zen keeps unsettling that shortcut. That is why explanation remains necessary and insufficient at once. Without explanation, important ideas collapse into slogans. No thought becomes blankness. Ordinary mind becomes mediocrity. Practice realization becomes passivity. Non-grasping becomes apathy. Zen needs language because confusion is easy. Yet no amount of explanation can replace the change in relation itself. The sentence can illuminate a path. It cannot walk it on your behalf. There is a practical humility here. A person may understand tonight that peace becomes fragile when treated as property. Tomorrow they may again begin counting progress. They may know the distinction clearly and still resume the old bargain with calm. That does not make the explanation useless. It means explanation is pointer, not possession. The map is real help. Trouble begins when the map is used as proof that the ground has been mastered. Zen's critique of language is therefore not anti-intellectual theatre. Some people hear that words cannot hold a reality and turn the claim into grand vagueness. They speak as though silence alone were authentic, and any careful explanation were a fall from grace. Serious Zen writing itself refutes that performance. The tradition is full of words because people mishear, simplify, and flatter themselves. Language is one of the tools by which misunderstanding is exposed. What Zen denies is the self's wish to own reality through concept alone. A person may describe moonlight on water perfectly and still not touch the cold reflection itself. In the same way, someone may explain non-grasping brilliantly and still live by possession. A formula can become another piece of inventory. A teaching can become a badge. A subtle distinction can become prestige. The ego can steal almost anything, including the language used to criticize theft. This is one reason a long, slow argument is appropriate here. If the whole matter were reduced too quickly to a slogan, the mind would likely seize the slogan and continue unchanged. Better to let the distinctions unfold. Better to keep language working close to the wound, rather than standing above it as triumphant summary. Explanation has to stay humble enough to know it can be misused by the very self it is trying to expose. The late-night desire for peace makes this especially clear. We want one clean sentence, strong enough to end the circling. One thought that can close the case. One formula that turns experience into certainty. Zen mistrusts that desire because premature closure often protects the same old ownership. The self wants the matter settled so it can stop being vulnerable to the question. But some questions are meant to work on the self rather than be stored by it. That is why words cannot hold, not because they are false, but because they cannot become the owner's final guarantee. They can point, clarify, and pressure. They cannot replace seeing, and once that becomes clear, doubt stops looking like a mere failure of knowledge. It begins to look like a force that may break false certainty. The temptation to own the right phrase is stronger than it first appears. A person hears "stop seeking" and thinks the work is done because the formula is memorable. Another hears "ordinary mind" and turns it into a soft permission slip. Another hears "no thought" and imagines a pristine interior vacuum. A good phrase can illuminate, but it can also become private property almost instantly. Zen keeps phrases short partly because they strike hard. It keeps undoing them because the ego learns to display them as trophies. This is why explanation has to be both patient and modest. It cannot pretend that one sentence will finish the matter, yet it also cannot abandon clarity and take refuge in airy mystery. Without explanation, slogans become dangerous. With too much confidence in explanation, the self mistakes conceptual fluency for transformation. Zen's own literature lives inside that tension. It speaks because confusion is real. It refuses to let speech become possession. There is a knightly version of this problem as well. A tired mind longs for one sentence that will end all effort. If only I hear the exact line, I will finally stop circling. Sometimes a line does help. It can open the hand a little, but the self often wants more than help. It wants guarantee. It wants a sentence solid enough to replace vulnerability. That is precisely what Zen withholds, not out of cruelty, but because the wish for a guaranteed phrase is often the old search for property wearing a philosophical face. So the question must keep living longer than the slogan. Explanation remains valuable, but it cannot become the owner's last fortress. Once that is felt, doubt starts looking less like an embarrassment and more like a needed solvent. Some certainties deserve to be weakened because they were only defenses in polished language. There is a late-night version of this temptation that is almost tender. A person wants one sentence to carry them through the dark. They do not want an argument, they want a handle. Zen can offer handles, but it keeps warning that a handle is not a possession. The phrase only helps if it opens the hand. The moment it becomes an amulet proving that the matter is solved, it has been pulled back into ownership. A good sentence can steady a person. It cannot replace the relation the sentence was trying to name. That is why Zen writes so much and distrusts writing so much at the same time. It knows how badly human beings need careful distinctions. It also knows how quickly careful distinctions turn into prestige. Someone can explain no mind beautifully and still live as a collector of states. Someone can quote Dogen accurately and still negotiate with the night like a merchant. The words remain useful. They simply cannot become the final owner of what they clarify. This is one reason Zen conversation so often sounds pointed instead of complete. It wants to keep the person moving near the matter rather than sitting triumphantly above it. A sentence that does not allow ownership to settle may be better than a grand explanation that feels finished too soon. The best words here are not those that make the self feel magnificent. They are the ones that make the self less able to treat understanding as property. That is also why phrases in this tradition often feel unfinished in the best sense. They keep working after they are heard. They refuse to become furniture. A phrase that remains alive can interrupt grasping again tomorrow and again the night after that. A phrase treated as private possession becomes decorative almost immediately. Zen would rather leave a person slightly unsettled by a true sentence than perfectly pleased by a false finality. Most doubt feels like a temporary obstacle. You doubt because you do not yet know enough. You doubt because the answer has not been secured. The task is to remove the doubt through better information or stronger reasoning. Zen can place doubt in a different role. In traditions of koan work and great doubt, the question is not only a puzzle on the way to certainty, it becomes a pressure strong enough to undermine the self's ordinary confidence in conceptual mastery. Great doubt should not be romanticized. It is not fashionable uncertainty. It is not permanent indecision raised to spiritual dignity. It is not a mysterious mood meant to sound profound. It is a condition in which the question grows close enough to expose the one who is asking. The self can no longer stand safely outside the problem and manipulate it from a distance. The issue moves from the table into the bloodstream. The old wish to secure truth as possession begins to fail. This is why koans are misunderstood when they are treated as brain teasers. If the point was simply to solve a clever riddle, then the acquisitive mind would remain intact. It would win one more trophy. The answer would become private property. In serious practice, the koan resists that. It does not sit still as an object waiting to be mastered. It turns back on the self that wants mastery. The one who wanted an elegant solution discovers that the problem has started interrogating the solver. That movement matters for peace. Late at night, the mind wants an answer it can keep. Tell me what to do. Tell me what works. Tell me which inner move will finally secure the right state. Great doubt denies that form of relief, at least for a time. The denial is not cruelty. It comes from a suspicion that quick conceptual closure often serves the old hunger for control. The self wants certainty not only because certainty is true, but because certainty feels like possession. When doubt works differently, it strips the possessiveness. It exposes how often we ask for explanations in order to stop being vulnerable. We want the answer so that we can be done with the question. Zen sometimes allows the question to keep operating because being done too quickly would mean the seeker remained untouched. A question can become spiritually important not because it produces endless confusion, but because it removes false confidence. This is not the same as glorifying distress. Doubt, in the Zen sense, can be clarifying. It can reduce pretense. It can reveal where slogans, formulas, and second-hand certainty have been doing the work of defense. A person may become quieter, not because they found a triumphant answer, but because the appetite for false answers grows weaker. Something in them stops needing to possess every conclusion. Traditions differ, and great doubt should not be made into a universal mood covering all of Zen. Still, the lesson travels well. There are times when immediate resolution would only strengthen the old self. The more honest path is to let the question remain active until the stance of ownership itself begins to erode. That is why Zen can feel calm and demanding at once. It calms by refusing counterfeit certainty. It demands because the ego does not surrender its claims willingly. At this point, the whole matter is ready for one of Zen's most famous scenes. A person asks for the mind to be pacified. Bodhidharma tells him to bring the mind, and he will pacify it. The request seems simple. The search it demands reveals how unstable the whole objectifying picture has been. The question is no longer only what answer will solve the problem. Soon the deeper issue appears. What would it even mean to hand the problem over as though it were one owned thing? That is the opening Bodhidharma widens. Great doubt matters here because the easy answer is often the ego's favorite refuge. We want information that lets us stop trembling before the question. We want certainty that can be placed on a shelf and revisited whenever fear returns. Koan practice is harsh toward that wish. It does not reward the self for collecting the correct explanation. It keeps turning the light back on the one who wants explanation in the form of ownership. The question stays alive long enough to make the owner uneasy. That can sound unkind until we remember how often counterfeit certainty deepens the trap. If a person believes they have already solved the matter because they learned the right formula, their vigilance simply grows more refined. They monitor themselves using better language. They congratulate themselves for understanding non-grasping while still clutching inwardly. Great doubt breaks that false peace. It is a refusal to let elegant explanation harden into private comfort. There is also an honesty in doubt that belongs to this tradition's calm. The calm does not come from wrapping everything up. It comes from no longer needing every uncertainty abolished at once. A person can sit nearer to the unsolved question without rushing to capture it. That is not passivity. It is endurance without premature closure. The room grows quieter because the owner has less false certainty to defend. When a question works this deeply, it stops being mere content. It becomes a pressure on the one who asks. That is exactly why Bodhidharma's exchange lands so hard. The one who wants the mind pacified is about to discover that the object they hoped to present cannot be produced in the form ownership imagined. There is a discipline in letting the question remain alive. Most of us want understanding to reduce vulnerability as quickly as possible. Great doubt does almost the opposite. It keeps vulnerability in place long enough for self-protective certainty to weaken. That can feel severe, but it is one reason Zen so often sounds honest rather than merely soothing. The tradition would rather let a person remain exposed to the real problem than cover that problem with a sentence that flatters ownership. And once doubt is doing that work, the Bodhidharma scene stops sounding like clever theatre. It becomes recognizably human. Here is the burden. Here is the wish to have it settled from outside. Here is the shock of discovering that the burden cannot be isolated as cleanly as the owner assumed. The koan does not remove suffering like a trick. It removes one of the pictures by which suffering had been organized. Great doubt also protects the tradition from being reduced to gentle reassurance. If Zen only soothed, the self could use it as another consumer product, a calmer mood, a better method, a more attractive interior brand. Doubt interrupts consumption. It makes the person less able to treat the teaching as something merely taken home and added to private inventory. That interruption is one reason the path can remain alive instead of becoming a shelf of agreeable ideas. This is why doubt can be strangely clarifying even when it is uncomfortable. It removes the false comfort that comes from thinking the matter has already been settled in your favor. It keeps the person from rushing back into management with a new slogan. The room may remain unresolved, but it is resolved less falsely. Zen is often willing to trade quick relief for that kind of honesty. There is a maturity in being able to remain near an unfinished question without immediately turning it into self-punishment. Great doubt is not panic without end. It is pressure without counterfeit closure. That distinction matters. Panic still wants escape. Great doubt keeps the self honest long enough that escape through ownership becomes less convincing. In that sense, doubt is not opposite to calm. It is one of the ways false calm is stripped away. There is a longing hidden inside the wish to hand the burden over. Here is my mind. Here is the thing that will not settle. Here is the inward trouble I am tired of carrying. Please fix it. Almost everyone understands that wish. It is not absurd. If mind were a troubled object, perhaps the right authority, method, or teacher could finally stabilize it. The power of Bodhidharma's exchange lies in how directly it accepts the request and then lets the request collapse under its own assumptions. Bring me your mind, and I will pacify it. The sentence sounds like a promise. It seems to grant exactly what is desired. But then the search begins. Where is the mind that can be brought forth? Where is the stable object that can be isolated, held out, and repaired from outside? Experience is certainly there. Pain is certainly there. Restlessness is certainly there. But the objectified mind refuses to stand still in the form the request assumed. This does not mean nothing exists. It does not mean suffering is imaginary. It means the objectifying gesture fails. The self cannot finally hold mind over against itself as one owned thing. The searcher and the searched are entangled. The activity of grasping belongs to what is being grasped. That is why the mind cannot simply be passed across the room like a broken instrument waiting for repair. The fantasy of clean pacification begins to crack. The same fantasy often governs quieter late-night efforts. We imagine that the trouble can be located, stabilized, and then removed. We imagine a finished piece that could be installed if only the right inward move were found. Bodhidharma's demand exposes how strange that hope is. What exactly are you trying to present? What exactly do you think you own when you say my mind? What stable thing do you imagine can be finalized as my peace? What makes the koan enduring is that it stages an ordinary dream in compressed form. We want inward life to become manageable by becoming object-like. If it could be described clearly enough, then perhaps it could be fixed once and for all. Bodhidharma does not answer by giving a better description. He allows the search for the object to exhaust itself. In that exhaustion, the seeker sees that what was wanted never existed in the required form. Ownership had been assumed before clarity. The exchange should also be protected from macho misreadings. It is not a scene of spiritual toughness mocking human need. Real people need care, companionship, instruction, and help. The koan is making a narrower philosophical point. It is exposing the possessive structure hidden in the request for pacification. The pain is not being laughed at. The object language of ownership is being destabilized. Once that destabilization begins, peace changes shape. It can no longer mean custody over a finished inner object. The hand comes back empty, but not unchanged. Empty because the claim to possession has weakened. Empty because the self cannot finally store mind as property. Empty because what was wanted was never a thing standing over there waiting to be captured. This is not yet serenity. It is a serious loss of illusion. That loss prepares the next Dogen-like turn. If mind cannot be owned in the form imagined, and peace cannot be stored as an object, then the self that behaved like owner must itself be re-examined. Self-forgetting now sounds less mystical and more exact. The claimant loses solidity. The hunter was never outside the forest. It belonged to the field it thought it was supervising. That is why forgetting the grasping self becomes the next necessary step in the argument. The power of the koan lies in how ordinary its fantasy is. We all want some clean handoff. Here is the problem. Take it away, stabilize it, return it to me repaired. The request is human. Zen does not mock its humanity. It does question the picture hidden inside it. The picture assumes that mind is a discrete thing the self can present, and that peace is a condition some authority can install once the thing has been isolated. Bodhidharma lets that picture collapse under examination. Once the search begins, the seeker discovers entanglement everywhere. Mind is not nowhere, yet it will not stand still as an object apart from the searcher. The one looking for it belongs to the disturbance being examined. The owner cannot fully step outside what they call my mind and hold it up like a damaged bowl. That does not abolish suffering. It abolishes a fantasy of clean possession. The emptiness of the hand is not nihilism. It is the failure of ownership. That failure is philosophically important because it changes what pacification can mean. If mind cannot be possessed as a stable object, then peace cannot mean successful custody over such an object. The old dream of a permanently managed inner state loses coherence. Something loosens before serenity appears. Illusion weakens before comfort does. Zen is willing to make that trade because false comfort bought through possession only tightens the room later. So the koan leaves the seeker empty-handed in a fruitful way. What cannot be brought forth cannot be owned in the old sense. And once ownership of mind begins to falter, Dogen's call to forget the self no longer sounds like decorative mysticism. It sounds like the next honest response to a claim that has lost its object. This is why the koan remains relevant outside monastic settings and doctrinal debates. Anyone who has tried to pacify themselves by force already knows its pressure. We want a mind object because objects can be managed. We want something we can name, hold out, and repair. Bodhidharma refuses that convenience. He does not deny the distress. He denies the object language that promised an easy form of mastery over the distress. Once that convenience is gone, something humbling happens. The self cannot keep pretending to be pure manager. It belongs to the confusion it wanted to tidy from outside. That discovery can feel like loss, and in one sense it is. The owner loses the clean object it wanted, but the loss also opens a path. Without the old claim to possession, self-forgetting becomes less like mystic drama and more like a practical weakening of proprietorship. The scene also helps explain why Zen does not hand out a final procedure for inner repair. A procedure strong enough to guarantee the result would immediately become one more object of possession. The self would hold it, protect it, compare it, and judge itself by it. Bodhidharma's refusal is therefore not only a rejection of one bad question, it is a rejection of the whole hope that peace could be secured by finding the right thing to own inwardly. There is something humbling here for anyone who has spent years searching for the decisive inner instrument. The mind wants a key because a key can be carried, a key can be relied on, a key can become part of identity. Bodhidharma leaves the hand without a key. What remains is not helplessness. It is a different kind of seriousness, one less excited by possession and more willing to stay with what cannot be managed as an object. That seriousness has a practical effect on the night itself. Instead of spending every minute searching for the missing instrument, a person can begin noticing the search as one more form of tightening. The hand reaching for the final tool is part of the old pattern. Seeing that does not settle the mind all at once. It does make the hunt less innocent, and once the hunt looks less innocent, its authority starts to weaken. That seriousness can feel austere, but it may actually be kinder than endless technique hunting. Technique hunting keeps implying that the next missed solution is your fault. Bodhidharma interrupts that cycle. He shows that one of the things being chased never existed in the form the chase required. The failure is not simply personal inadequacy. The whole picture of ownership was misleading. That insight can remove a deep layer of blame even while it takes away fantasy of control. The idea of loosening the self provokes fear because ownership feels like protection. If the manager relaxes, who keeps the night from falling apart? If the one who monitors everything stops monitoring, who remains to secure order? These fears are important because they show how deeply the modern self trusts control. Self-forgetting therefore sounds dangerous for a reason. It threatens the authority of the inward foreman who has long claimed to be the only part capable of saving the situation. Yet the self Dogen is loosening is not the whole fact of lived personhood. He is not commanding a person to become nobody in a crude sense. The self at issue is the appropriating center, the one who claims, judges, and arranges everything around ownership. The self that says my peace, my progress, my failure, my proof. To forget that self is not to vanish from experience. It is to weaken the claim that experience exists chiefly as material for possession. This matters because the inward manager often presents itself as neutral. It looks like reason taking charge. But the manager is not outside the pattern we have been tracing. It is one of the pattern's most persistent forms. It wants to stand over the evening, over thought, over sensation, over memory. and administer them into order. When Dogen moves from self-study to self-forgetting, he is refusing to perfect that manager. He is refusing to let ownership become more efficient and call the result freedom. There is a deep emotional resistance here. Many people fear that if the owner weakens, disorder will swallow everything. Without a firm self at the center, how could care survive? How could responsibility survive? How could love survive? Zen's answer is not to deny those concerns. It is to distinguish between lived personhood and appropriating centrality. The former remains. The latter is what tightens the room into a contest. What weakens is not care, but proprietorship. Dogen's line about being enlightened by all things belongs here because it describes a relation no longer organized by conquest. Reality need not always arrive as something the self seizes and arranges. The world can come forth. The floor can be floor. The breath can be breath. A sound can be heard before it is turned into a personal verdict. This is not mystical spectacle. It is ordinary receptivity after the claim of ownership has thinned a little. That thinning also weakens the courtroom of the night. If peace is no longer proof of competence, then unrest is no longer pure indictment. The room stops being a trial the self must win. There may still be fatigue, grief, fear, or old agitation, but these are no longer automatically converted into evidence that the owner has failed. The loss of ownership becomes, quietly, a relief from total self-judgment. The seeker, therefore, becomes less solid. At the beginning of tonight's argument, the self felt like the one stable thing in the room. Peace was elusive, but the owner of peace seemed firm. Zen troubles both sides. The object cannot be possessed, and the owner turns out to be contingent, anxious, entangled, unstable in its own way. Once that is seen, the search for peace as property begins to look less coherent from both directions. No heroic disappearance follows. The self does not vanish like a ghost in a story. The ordinary person remains with memory, duty, affection, grief, and history. What changes is the right to behave like landlord over every passing state. That change may sound modest. In lived experience, it can be immense. The whole room is no longer arranged around one claimant, and that is why the path returns to ordinary life rather than escaping it. Once ownership is weakened, the same world can be inhabited differently. Zen does not finish in abstraction. It returns to the floor, the threshold, the cup, the breath, and the next quiet room. The fear around self-forgetting deserves patience because many people hear it as a threat to moral seriousness. If the owner loosens, will responsibility loosen too? If the manager weakens, will care collapse? Zen's answer is careful. The part being loosened is not love, memory, or practical intelligence. It is the appropriating center that keeps making everything answer to possession. Responsibility can remain. Care can remain. What weakens is the demand that everything become mine in the thick, anxious sense of ownership. This is why Dogen's language can be tender without being sentimental. To be illuminated by all things is not to disappear into pleasant fog. It is to stop insisting that every event first pass through the owner's court. The world can have presence before it is drafted into private proof. A sound can be heard before it becomes accusation. A sensation can be felt before it becomes a report card. This is small in description and large in lived effect. Once that change begins, self-judgment loses some of its old fuel. The person no longer has to win stillness in order to deserve their own company. They no longer have to treat each restless minute as a moral failure. Fatigue may remain. Old fear may remain. But the room is less tightly ruled by verdict. In that softening, Zen stops sounding like a philosophy of denial and starts sounding like a philosophy of less ownership. That is also why the path must return to the ordinary, rather than climax in a special state. If the owner has really weakened, there is less appetite for a dramatic trophy. The same world returns, the same floor, the same breath. The difference is not theatrical. It is the loss of some inward proprietorship. The ordinary world becomes the truest place to test whether that loss is real. Self-forgetting, then, is less like disappearance and more like relinquishing a title deed. The self still lives, it still remembers, it still chooses and cares, but it is less eager to register every passing condition as private real estate. That is why the room can feel different without becoming mystical. The owner has loosened. Life is less constantly notarized as mine in the possessive sense. This is quiet philosophy, but it changes the feel of an evening. There is freedom in how undramatic this can be. The self often wants a visible sign that it has crossed a spiritual threshold. Something impressive, something confirmable. Zen keeps disappointing that vanity. The most important change may look like less insistence, less need to declare victory, less need to turn every quiet moment into proof. That disappointment is healthy because it deprives ownership of one more object to display. It also explains why ordinary life is the right setting for verification. In a simple room, with simple fatigue, with simple waiting, there is less room for grand performance. If a changed relation is real, it can show itself there. If it only survives in dramatic settings, it may still be theatre. Zen trusts the ordinary, precisely because the ordinary makes vanity easier to detect and less rewarding to maintain. After a long argument about self, thought, language and doubt, many people expect a dramatic conclusion, a purified state, a shining interior, a clear separation between the ordinary person and the awakened one. Zen resists that appetite. The room does not vanish. The body remains a body. Thoughts may still rise. Fatigue may still be present. If realization depended on escaping ordinary life, this would count as failure. Zen says something harder. The ordinary world is where the truth of the matter has always been tested. This return should not be confused with sentimental simplicity. Zen is not saying that cups, floors, and evening light are automatically profound. It is not using ordinary objects as cute symbols of spiritual coziness. The point is sharper. Ordinary life is where grasping is most visible. The self wants a dramatic elsewhere because drama is easier to own. A special state can serve prestige. A changed relation in the middle of the ordinary leaves the ego with much less to display. That is why everyday action becomes decisive. How is the cup held? How is interruption received? How is waiting inhabited? How is fatigue met when it does not quickly produce the desired result? The path cannot hide behind atmosphere at that point. Ordinary life becomes the proving ground because it strips away so many of the ways the self flatters itself. Without special scenery, possession is easier to recognize. This also prevents philosophy from floating away from human life. A person may talk beautifully about no mind and non-grasping while still living as owner of every inconvenience. Zen drags the matter back to where people actually breathe, work, tire, remember, and meet one another. The same room that once felt like a stage for self-surveillance remains the room in which ownership can loosen. Nothing spectacular has to happen for the relation to change. There is a discipline hidden in that modesty. The modern self often wants wisdom to culminate in climax. Surely after Dogen, Huineng, Mizu, koans, and all the rest, there should be an unmistakable inner event. Zen resists that demand because climax itself can become one more possession. The ego would gladly own enlightenment as peak experience. Ordinary life denies that glamour. The transformation, if it is real, may be quieter than the self hoped and more disruptive to pride because of that. Ordinary mind should sound different now than it did earlier. It no longer names a soft mood or lazy acceptance. It names life without theatrical spiritual selfhood. It names attention that does not need special lighting in order to count. It names the possibility that the everyday world is sufficient field for the loosening of grasping. Not because the everyday is automatically pure, but because acquisition can be seen and weakened there without the help of spectacle. This does not make ordinary life easy. A cluttered room stays cluttered. Old sorrow does not disappear. The body still wants rest. The point is not that everything becomes pleasant. The point is that peace no longer depends on leaving the ordinary behind. The same life that once seemed impossible to bear without private victory can be met with less ownership, less performance, less demand for proof. The world remains. The contract weakens. At that point, one final confusion must be cleared away. Zen is not attacking peace itself. It is not celebrating agitation. It is not saying that the wish for relief from unrest was naive from the beginning. Peace still matters. The issue is how peace matters once property is removed from the picture. That final clarification is necessary because otherwise the whole argument could be misheard as refined contempt. Zen is not proud of your suffering. It is trying to free the wish for peace from the ownership that keeps corrupting it. Ordinary life matters so much because it defeats spiritual theatre. A person can speak finely in a quiet room, then reveal ownership the moment they are interrupted, delayed, or made uncomfortable. The cup, the threshold, the waiting, the untidy hour before sleep, the unfinished conversation from the day, the body asking for rest without guarantee. These are the places where grasping shows itself clearly. Zen returns there because that is where the argument becomes honest. This return also keeps philosophy from becoming travel literature about remote purity. The truth of no grasping is not reserved for unusual scenery. It is tested when the room is familiar, the body is ordinary, and the mind is doing what minds do. If the relation changes there, then something has truly shifted. If the relation only changes in staged conditions, the self may simply be collecting atmosphere. Zen has too much suspicion of possession to be satisfied with that. There is something bracing in the refusal of climax. We want the argument to culminate in a special crown, a final state, a visible difference the self can display to itself. Ordinary life refuses this glamour. If peace remains possible there, it will not look like victory over life. It will look like less proprietorship inside life, less courtroom logic, less insistence that the evening prove something about worth. The same world stays in place. The owner loosens. That is why the final clarification about peace is so important. Without it, the whole return to ordinary life could be mistaken for resignation. It is not resignation, it is a refusal to lie. Peace still matters deeply. Rest still matters. Relief still matters. The question is how to let them matter without turning them into trophies, contracts, or weapons against the self. The ordinary world is where that question becomes lived rather than discussed. A glass of water is lifted, a hallway is crossed, a light is turned off, a body lies down again without knowing whether sleep will come soon. None of those moments are grand, yet each can reveal whether the self is still bargaining for proof, or whether it has grown a little less possessive. Zen trusts these plain scenes because they do not flatter the ego with spectacle. They simply ask for honesty. That honesty makes the next clarification unavoidable. If peace still matters here, in the same unglamorous life, then peace cannot be merely a decorative word Zen keeps refusing. It must remain a real human good, but one whose goodness has to be separated from ownership. That is the last balance the argument has to hold. It also means that returning to ordinary life is not a downgrade from higher insight. It is the place where higher insight either survives or exposes itself as theatre. The same sink, same bed, same pause before turning off the light, same anxious glance toward the clock. If Zen has any truth here, it has to enter those moments without requiring them to become picturesque. Otherwise, peace is still being treated as something that belongs only to special conditions. Ordinary life exposes that lie quickly. This is why ordinary life can be more severe than overtly spiritual settings. In overtly spiritual settings, the ego has many places to hide. It can borrow the room, the language, the ritual. At home, in ordinary hours, there is much less to borrow. You are left with how you hold the next interruption, the next stray thought, the next minute of not knowing whether sleep will come. The plainness of the setting removes excuses. That is one reason Zen keeps returning there. And yet, that same plainness can be merciful. Because the scene is ordinary, the person does not have to perform wisdom spectacularly. They only have to hold the next moment a little less tightly. They only have to stop turning each small fluctuation into proof of triumph or collapse. The ordinary world is severe because it sees through theatre. It is merciful because it accepts small, honest changes that the ego would overlook for lacking drama. After hearing so much suspicion directed at the search for peace, a listener could reasonably wonder whether Zen has simply turned against peace itself. Maybe the tradition thinks calm is trivial. Maybe it secretly glorifies unrest. Maybe all this critique of grasping is a severe way of saying that mature people should stop wanting relief. That would be a false conclusion. Restlessness hurts. Fatigue hurts. The body knows the difference between torment and ease. Zen does not become wise by pretending otherwise. What it challenges is not the value of calm, but the possessive form through which calm is often pursued. This distinction is delicate and vital. Human beings need rest. Human beings long for steadiness. The question is not whether that longing exists. The question is what the longing becomes when it hardens into guarantee, inventory, and control. A real need can be distorted by the first strategy used to meet it. This is true beyond spiritual language. Love can become ownership. Care can become domination. Responsibility can become coercion. In the same way, the wish for peace can become a contract the world can never satisfy. Zen is not against the wish any more than it is against care. It is against the form in which the self tries to turn the wished-for thing into secure property. That is why the argument remains humane even while it refuses comfort language. The refusal of comfort language is itself part of that humanity. If Zen promised guaranteed peace, it would flatter the same self that keeps tightening around the problem. It would sell stillness as product. It would encourage the listener to become consumer of transcendence. Instead, it keeps the boundary honest. No method for ownership, no certificate of permanent calm, no triumph over vulnerability disguised as wisdom. The tradition would rather leave the wish exposed than lie to it. This is where the shape of wanting becomes the decisive issue. A person can long for quiet with open hands or with a fist. The fist says peace must arrive, must last, must prove something, must belong to me in a way that shields me from return of unrest. The open hand says the wish is real, but it will not become a fortress of ownership. Zen does not ask the person to stop wanting. It asks whether wanting can stop behaving like capture. That is hard because capture feels safer. If peace becomes possession, then perhaps life can finally be arranged against uncertainty. But a peace owned that way is already fragile. It requires guarding, it requires measurement, it requires fear of loss. The self turns the desired state into a burden. Zen's honesty is to say that a peace worth having cannot be reduced to that burden without being spoiled. This is why peace without guarantee is not a lesser peace merely tolerated by philosophy. It may be the first truthful form the wish can take. Peace can still matter deeply, even when it is no longer imagined as a permanent trophy. The body may still desire rest. The mind may still welcome quiet. What changes is that quiet is no longer recruited into a fantasy of total self-security. It matters as relation rather than possession. Such an ending will disappoint those who want a method strong enough to abolish uncertainty. Zen does not satisfy that desire. It changes the desire by changing the question beneath it. The point is no longer how to own peace. The point is how to let peace matter without making it prey. That is not a cure. It is a transformation in the shape of the problem. And once the problem changes, one final image becomes possible. Attention remains. Not indifferent attention, not blank attention, not triumphant attention. Attention freed, at least a little, from the need to capture what it meets. That is where the path ends for tonight. It matters that Zen never solves the problem by belittling the wish. A tired body really does long for ease. A restless mind really does know the difference between torment and relief. To deny that would not be wisdom. It would be another kind of hardness. The tradition is sharper than that. It asks whether the first strategy used to meet a real need may be the very strategy that distorts the need. A human wish can be true and still be handled badly. That is why the image of open hand and fist helps. The fist does not merely want peace, it wants peace to guarantee something. It wants peace to testify that the self is safe, adequate, and finally in command. The open hand still wants quiet, but it no longer demands ownership as the price of letting quiet matter. The longing remains. What changes is the contract inside the longing. Zen is not against the wish, it is against the way the wish turns into capture. This leaves uncertainty in place, and that is exactly why some people resist it. Guarantee feels safer than relation. Trophy feels safer than vulnerability. Yet the trophy had become a burden anyway. A peace that must be guarded every minute is not much peace at all. It keeps the self employed as sentry. Zen would rather leave the wish honest and unfinished than turn it into a false fortress. That honesty is not glamorous, it is humane. From here it becomes easier to name what remains. If peace still matters, but no longer as prey, then what remains is not blankness and not defeat. What remains is a different kind of attention. Attention still involved, still vulnerable, but no longer organized as a hunt. This is also why the final clarification about peace must not be rushed. Without it, the whole path could sound like a polished refusal of comfort. But Zen is not trying to prove how tough it is. It is trying to keep the wish for peace from being corrupted by the first possessive strategy the self reaches for. Peace remains a real good. It simply stops functioning as a private fortress against uncertainty. Once that is seen, attention no longer sounds like a thin substitute. It sounds like the form a less possessive life can take. Not a reward in place of peace, but the way peace is no longer strangled by the demand to become property. That is the quiet transition into the last movement of the argument. This means the wish for peace can survive the critique and come out truer. It is no longer forced to pretend it wants nothing. It no longer has to harden into a demand for guarantee. It can remain a wish, honest and exposed, without recruiting the whole self into a project of ownership. Zen does not cure the wish by killing it. It cures the wish of one particular violence, the violence of turning rest into proof that life must finally obey. That matters because many people quietly fear that if they stop clutching at peace, they will stop caring about peace altogether. Zen shows a different possibility. Clutching is not the only form care can take. A wish can remain sincere without becoming coercive. In fact, it may become more sincere once it is no longer burdened with the job of proving that the self is finally safe from uncertainty. Attention without hunting is more active than it first sounds. It does not collapse into haze. It notices, returns, receives, and stays. The difference lies in what it is no longer secretly doing. It is no longer dragging every experience toward proof. A thought may arise without being drafted into a private trial. A quiet moment may arrive without instantly being locked inside a plan for keeping it forever. The room can be met without being raided for trophies. This does not remove vulnerability. Zen does not exchange the hunt for invulnerability. Thoughts still come, fatigue still presses, fear may still flare. But the relation becomes lighter because ownership is less absolute. The self is less committed to converting every movement into personal verdict. Looking softens when it no longer has to conquer what it sees. Even difficulty can be held that way, not erased but less possessed. That is why the final question sounds quieter than the first. It is no longer how to capture peace without frightening it away. It is what kind of attention remains when capture is no longer the governing instinct. That question does not offer a method in the old sense. It offers a changed relation. The shift is smaller than fantasy wanted and truer because of that. It can live in a real room with a real body on a real night. If the hunt for peace is mistrusted, if possession is the trouble, if formulas cannot be owned, and if the self itself loses some of its central claim, it is natural to ask what remains. Zen's answer is not passivity. What remains is attention, but attention of another kind. Not attention as surveillance, not attention as acquisition, not attention as a net thrown over experience so that the right outcome can be hauled in and stored. Attention without hunting, that phrase gathers much of what has happened tonight. The mind hunted stillness, the self hunted a better state. Practice was hunted as reward, thought was hunted as enemy, formulas were hunted as solutions. Even calm, when it briefly appeared, was hunted as property to be kept. Attention without hunting changes the whole arrangement. It does not abolish care. It abolishes, or at least weakens, the possessive aggression hidden inside care. This kind of attention can stay with breath, sensation, fatigue, thought, silence, or returning memory without instantly turning them into verdicts. It can notice disturbance without declaring the night lost. It can receive a quiet moment without moving at once to preserve it. It can remain near what happens without appointing itself owner of what happens. That may look modest. Inwardly it is immense, because the whole mood of possession begins to loosen. It is also more active than it first sounds. Attention without hunting is not collapse. It is not dullness. It is not resignation dressed up as wisdom. It attends, returns, receives, and stays. The difference is inside the staying. The mind is no longer trying to force experience to pay out as proof. It no longer demands that each appearance justify itself before the owner. Even discipline changes under those conditions. The evening is no longer being raided for trophies. Vulnerability remains. That must be said plainly. Thoughts still arise. Old wounds may still stir. The body may still be restless. Zen does not install invulnerability in place of the old turmoil. What changes is relation, not immunity, but less ownership, not perfect silence, but less compulsion to convert sound into failure, not abolition of pain, but less insistence that pain define the whole of the self. The shift is smaller than fantasy wanted, and truer because of that. This is why a real change need not look spectacular. The room remains the room. The same life remains the same life. A difficult night may still remain difficult in many ways, yet attention can become lighter because it is no longer dragging every appearance toward capture. The self is less busy taking inventory. Looking softens when it no longer has to conquer what it sees. Even a hard night may contain that softening. The central question therefore changes in a durable way. It is no longer how do I capture peace without frightening it away. It is no longer what technique will secure stillness once and for all. It becomes something quieter. What kind of attention remains when peace is no longer treated as prey? What kind of self remains when ownership grows thinner? How lightly can experience be held without becoming indifferent to it? Some listeners will still want firmer instruction than that. Fair enough. Zen does not answer every hunger the same way, but it is important to hear the difference between withholding a trick and changing the problem. This tradition is not hiding the secret method out of cruelty. It is showing why the craving for a secret method belonged to the old arrangement from the beginning. The hunt was not innocent, the contract was not neutral, the owner was not outside the trouble, so attention remains, quiet, unforced, still vulnerable, less acquisitive. Peace is not denied. The wish for it is not mocked. What weakens is the claim that peace must become mine in order to matter, and that weakening may be the first place the search itself grows quiet. Attention also remains near the body in a more honest way. The breath is still felt, fatigue is still felt, the pulse of unease may still be felt, but these do not have to be converted at once into a report about personal success or failure. Attention can stay near the body without drafting the body into a courtroom. That is one reason the result sounds quieter than a technique. It is less about achieving a state than about loosening the reflex that turns every state into owned evidence. There is no triumph in that, and that is part of its truth. The room does not become sacred, the person does not become invulnerable. The night may still be hard, yet the hardness need not be amplified by a hunt for private victory. Attention without hunting is not flashy enough for the ego to love, but it is often gentle enough for life to bear. That is why Zen keeps trusting it, and because it is so unflashy, attention without hunting can be missed. The ego looks for fireworks and overlooks the simple absence of one old violence. It overlooks the fact that a thought came and was not turned into a trial. It overlooks the fact that a quiet minute passed and was not seized as property. It overlooks the fact that the body remained imperfect and was not condemned for that imperfection. Yet, these small losses of violence are often where the room actually begins to change. Attention without hunting also means there is less pressure to turn each night into a verdict about the rest of your life. A difficult evening does not have to prove that nothing has changed. A peaceful evening does not have to prove that everything has. Experience can be allowed to be local again. This hour can be this hour. The body can be tired without becoming a symbol. The mind can be restless without becoming destiny. That localness is one of the forms non-possession takes, and perhaps that is one of the quietest gifts in Zen's refusal to let peace become property. When ownership weakens, the future loses some of its tyrannical hold over the present. A hard night is not automatically prophecy. A calm night is not automatically victory. The person is returned to what is actually here, which may be unfinished and still bearable. Attention does not need to promise salvation in order to offer that. It only needs to stop hunting long enough to see the room as it is. In that sense, the search grows quiet, not because every question is answered, but because the old aggressions weaken. The self is less busy trying to seize, preserve, and certify. The room is still only a room. The body is still only a body. The night may still carry thought, memory, and waiting. Yet something has changed. Experience is being met with less possession. And for Zen, that may be the nearest thing to peace that does not immediately vanish under the demand to own it. This is not a heroic ending, and perhaps that is why it can be trusted. Nothing has to be exaggerated to make it sound worthwhile. The mind is not crowned. The room is not purified. The self is not made magnificent by what it has understood. There is only less hunting, less fear of each passing movement, less insistence that quiet become private property. For a tradition so suspicious of possession that modesty is not a weakness, it is part of the truth it has been trying to protect all along. And if that sounds smaller than the promises usually made about peace, that may be exactly the point. Zen would rather leave you with a truer relation than a larger fantasy. A truer relation can stay in the room when the fantasy fails. It can stay with a body that is still tired and a mind that is still alive. That is not everything the self once wanted. It may be more real. It may also be enough for one night, which is sometimes the only honest measure that matters. And one honest night is worth more than 1,000 borrowed promises. That is enough to leave quietly in the room. For now, that is enough. So the end of the path is not climax, but a different posture toward what comes and goes. Attention stays, care stays. The wish for quiet stays. What weakens is the owner's right to turn every passing state into property. And in that weakening, the room can become quieter without having to become perfect. If we return now to the room where all of this began, very little has changed on the surface. It is still night. The body is still a body. Thought may still move. Fatigue may still press close. Nothing in Zen allows us to pretend otherwise. There is no honest version of this tradition that turns the night into a guaranteed success, or the mind into a perfectly obedient instrument, or the self into a flawless keeper of serenity. What has changed is harder to show and easier to feel. The room is no longer quite so thoroughly organized around ownership. Peace has stopped looking like a thing that must be won, guarded, and kept as proof of inward competence. The search itself has come under suspicion, not because the wish for quiet was foolish, but because that wish had been turned into property, and property was already making the room tight. Dogen sharpened that by showing how the self keeps carrying itself forward to meet experience as owner and judge. Practice without reward interrupted the bargain by which the self wanted to purchase stillness later. Wienen and the language of no thought prevented peace from being confused with blankness. Mazu prevented the path from becoming spiritual costume. Koan and great doubt kept certainty from being treated as private trophy. Bodhidharma exposed how hard it is even to present mind as the kind of object the owner imagined. Taken together, none of these moves produce a marketable method. They do something stranger. They keep removing the forms of possession by which the self hoped to solve itself. They keep asking whether calm has been made impossible not only by noise, but by the one who wants to own what quiet would be. They keep returning the problem from technique to relation. That is why Zen does not have to mock the wish for peace. Peace still matters. Rest still matters. Relief from needless inner struggle still matters. The tradition simply refuses to let peace become one more fortress for the self. It refuses to call ownership wisdom. It refuses to pretend that guaranteed stillness can be sold without corruption. The wish remains human. The hunt becomes less trustworthy. So the final question is quieter than the one that first brought us here, and perhaps more difficult to possess. Not how do I capture peace, not what method finally guarantees the right state. Something simpler and less secure than that. What kind of attention remains when peace is no longer prey? What happens when the owner loosens? What happens when the evening is no longer treated like a test whose prize must be carried away? Zen does not answer with grand climax. It answers with a lighter relation, a mind that may still move, but need not turn each movement into verdict. A room that may still be imperfect, but need not become a courtroom. A wish for quiet that need not become a contract. A self that need not disappear, yet no longer claims the right to own every passing state. Peace, in that sense, is not denied and not possessed. It is released from property. And what remains after that release is not failure, not vacancy, not indifference, but a quieter way of being present with what is here, even when what is here is unfinished.